All right, hello everyone. We will get started. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar about our CIRA Community Investment Program grants and the application process for this year. I'm Erica Howes and I'm on our communications team, and I'm here with Maureen. And Maureen James is our Community Investment Program Manager at CIRA. So this webinar today is for people interested in preparing a grant application for our 2021 funding call, which is open until April 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And a recording of this webinar will be available afterwards, likely later this week, through the CIRA website. And we'll post on our YouTube channel. It'll be in the same section where you registered to attend today. And a few logistical details. Given the large number of people we have participating in the webinar today, which is great, you are all muted. So please type your questions in the right-hand panel and we'll make sure to answer them at the end. If you can't see that control panel to ask questions, you can click on the orange arrow to expand it. And we'll ask that you put the questions in the question area and not the chat, just so we make sure we can see them all in one place.
And we're going to turn our cameras off now so you can focus on the meat of this presentation. See you later.
And so in this session today, I'll first go over some things we will cover. We'll talk about the actual application timeline, the eligibility and funding focus areas, the evaluation criteria, how to use the online application system, and some application tips. And then we'll make sure at the end we'll leave some time for question and answer as well. So a bit about who we are. We're CIRA, the Canadian Internet Registration Authority. And CIRA is best known for our role managing the .ca on behalf of all Canadians. We're kind of like the internet phone book for websites that end in .ca. So we run all of the systems that make sure you get safely and securely to the correct .ca website when you type it in. And we currently have more than 3 million .ca domains under management. And while that is really our #1 priority, the safe and secure management of that domain, as a non-for-profit ourselves, we also have this much bigger goal to ensure a trusted internet for Canadians. So it's really our mission at CIRA to give back to Canada's internet. And so we set aside revenue annually to fund these kind of community internet projects. And so all of CIRA's community investment program funding resources are really made possible through revenues earned from .ca website registrations and renewals. So that's the kind of connection there and how we work.
All right, thanks, Erica. Let's get right into this year's grants call. This chart gives you an overview of this year's grants timeline. The application period opened last week on Tuesday, March 2nd, and it closes on Wednesday, April 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We emphasize the time zone in the deadline because we have applicants from across the country and our online system does not accept late applications. It automatically closes at the 2 p.m. Eastern Standard deadline. And while that is the absolute deadline, the one thing we can't emphasize enough, and we'll emphasize over and over again during this session, is get your application in early. Why do we say that? When your application is submitted into our online system, CIRA staff review it to ensure it is eligible and complete. All reviews take place as soon as applications are submitted, and we send you a follow-up email if anything is missing or incorrect. And typically, 50% of the applications submitted require some adjustment before they can be accepted. So you think you have a great application, it's all done, you submit. Watch your email to see if we have any feedback on anything. For example, missing documentation, sections left blank, budget revenues and expenses not matching. We do a pretty close read of everything before it gets moved on to the committee. So if anything is missing on the 14th of April at 2 p.m., we can't move it forward. It would be rejected. So that's why we strongly recommend you submit your application earlier before the deadline, so we can review it and you'll have time to make any adjustments. Only complete eligible applications will be forwarded to the panel for review. If your application passes the eligibility review, it moves on to the evaluation panel. That panel reviews projects over a period of about 1 month and they'll be making their decisions about which projects to fund in late June. Then their recommendations to fund are provided to CIRA's Board of Directors for approval at the end of June. So we'll be notifying all applicants of the outcome of their application by email in July. If your project is chosen, you will receive a letter from us in July outlining the requirements for receiving the grant. So for planning purposes, in your application, you would consider mid-July your start time for any part of your project that is CIRA funded. Here's a quick overview of the specifics of this year's grants call. We have $1.25 million to fund internet projects. Not-for-profits, registered charities, and research institutions, so universities and colleges, are eligible. You can apply in English or French. Our French webinar is tomorrow at 2 p.m. and it will cover the same ground that we cover here today. Grants are available up to $100,000. One grant is available up to $250,000, and I'll make one note on that one. If you apply for the $250,000 grant, you wouldn't be considered for the $100,000 grants. So at the outset, you should choose which you're applying for. And of course, grant requests can always be lower than $100,000. It's fine to apply for $25,000 or $40,000 if that's what you need. We grant projects of all amounts. Another thing to keep in mind about eligibility is organizations that currently have active grants with us cannot apply to this round. So for example, if you have a grant from last year that's not completed yet, you would not be eligible for this year's round. You'd have to wait until 2022. Active grants must be reported, reviewed, and signed off by us before the organization can apply again. Another note is that normally projects are intended to be approximately 1 year in duration. However, we favor projects where the results can be sustained beyond that initial year. The one project we may grant up to $250,000 will have up to 2 years to implement. So those applications that come in are reviewed by the Community Investment Evaluation Panel, which is made up of 12 people. 4 are CIRA board members, and the other members are leaders in Canada's internet space who are independent of CIRA's board and of each other. And for the record, over the past 7 years, we've supported 171 projects with a total of $7.95 million.
All right, and now I'll be talking a bit about our funding areas for this year. So we fund innovative community projects that contribute to a trusted internet for all Canadians, back to our mission at CIRA. And we have prioritized 4 funding areas for 2021. This is internet infrastructure, digital literacy, cybersecurity, and community leadership. So for those who are familiar with CIRA's community investment program, or if you've applied in the past, you may notice that the online services category is no longer listed. Historically, this category included projects like building online apps, online content, platforms to address social, economic, environmental needs. But in order to make room for more internet infrastructure, digital literacy, cybersecurity, community leadership projects, it was decided we would no longer fund online services. So this is the same as last year, that we no longer have that online services category. So I'll speak a bit to each of the funding areas and what kinds of projects we fund in each. So for internet infrastructure, we fund connectivity research, feasibility studies, core infrastructure, last mile connectivity services, and operational solutions that increase performance, lower costs, and improve data sovereignty. And in many cases, infrastructure projects we know can be quite expensive, and it's totally fine to apply to CIRA for partial funding for a much bigger initiative. So for example, if you're putting in an application to the Universal Broadband Fund and need additional funding, or if you have a private sector partnership that need funds for community engagement or feasibility studies, these would be examples of those kind of things. We also fund digital literacy. So in this category is research, educational frameworks, learning resources, tools, and training programs to improve Canadians' digital literacy knowledge and skills. So clarification on digital literacy, though, just putting content online is not a digital literacy project. So we are specifically interested in projects that develop those digital skills. And our other two funding areas, cybersecurity. So research, educational frameworks, tools, and training programs that increase Canadians' online safety. And under community leadership, these are things like events, policy research that broaden public awareness and understanding of domestic internet policy and internet governance. And our project beneficiaries. So while CIRA's granting program will consider applications that benefit all Canadians, this year in 2021, we're especially looking for initiatives that benefit Northern, rural, and Indigenous communities and students. So that's kindergarten to grade 12 and post-secondary as well.
Okay, I will talk a little bit about what we don't fund. We like to be clear about that because we don't want applicants spending their time completing applications that are ineligible. So we do have a bit of a top 10 list of things that we don't fund. As Erica already mentioned, number one on that is online services. That's a former funded category that is no longer an area that we support. I've highlighted three areas in bold here, 2, 4, and another one on the next slide, number 6. They relate to end user equipment for individual use, proposals that provide generic IT training or equipment, and general fundraising appeals. I think given everything that's been going on with COVID, the need for equipment and the need for generic training and access to different rooms full of computers has increased overnight, basically, since a year ago. And unfortunately, those are not things that we fund. Equipment can be part of a project, but it can't be the whole project. So that is something that we just wanted to make sure you knew about. And general fundraising appeals, we understand how difficult it's been for so many organizations during the pandemic, but we don't fund all core costs or just general fundraising. It's very specific to whatever your internet related project is. So back to the top 10 list. Back on to number 3, we don't fund projects focused solely on website design, development, and deployment. Number 5, ones that are focused solely on travel, well, probably there aren't going to be too many of those this year, so that should be an easy one to avoid. And projects, as I mentioned, the general funding raising appeals are not eligible. Ongoing core operations, also not eligible, but you can get funding for the specific core people or equipment that you need to be able to deliver a project. So not all your organizational costs, but the ones that are targeted specifically to your project delivery. Retrospective costs means costs that you've already incurred. We cannot fund those. Marketing or research associated with marketing activities, again, not allowed, and projects whose main focus is outside of Canada would not be eligible. So we go through quite a close read of the proposals when they come in to check them for eligibility. So we look at that top 10 list of things we don't fund, but we also make sure that what you have presented is in line with what we do fund. And that's where we remind you that eligibility review is part of that April 14th, 2 p.m. deadline. So if we found something in the application that is incomplete or needs clarification, that has to be completed by April 14th. So you'll submit what you believe is a complete application. You will receive a confirmation from the system saying it was received, but that doesn't mean it's eligible. It just means it's been received by the system. So once it's in, our staff review the application for completeness and eligibility, and we'll follow up within about 2 days requesting any additional information, sometimes a lot quicker, especially towards the deadline. We do the best we can. But at least 50% of applications have needed some kind of follow-up. So please be on the lookout for follow-up messages from our system, from CIRA, cip@cira.ca, or from SurveyMonkey Apply, because they frequently get caught in spam filters. If the eligibility issues are adequately addressed by the deadline, then the application moves to the next stage. So let's assume your project has made it past the eligibility review and is being evaluated by our evaluation panel. There are 2 requirements that are not scored, but are evaluated as part of the process. And those 2 are: the project must align with CIRA's community investment program aimed to build a trusted internet for all Canadians, and the specific funding area being applied to, those 4 funding areas that Erica just went over. Your project must also be open source. And by that, we mean that it produces outputs that are open and available for anyone to use, share, and build upon. So those 2 things are something that the panel checks right out of the gate. And then after that, the project is evaluated by the panel and given a score out of 100, as you can see in the table on this slide. So the panel is looking for projects that reach the beneficiaries, the target beneficiaries, the ones that we're giving preference to this year. So northern, rural, and Indigenous communities, and students, K-12 and post-secondary. They're looking for projects that are realistically planned with clearly defined activities, outputs, and outcomes. So they'll be looking at your project plan for that. They want to know also that your organization or institution has the capacity and leadership to implement the project. They'll be looking for an innovative approach and for projects that are sustainable beyond the end of CIRA funding. And of course, they'll be looking at a budget. So they'll be looking for a reasonable budget that includes, if it's possible, some contribution from the applicant, so in-kind funding, or contributions from other sources, as well as that your project budget demonstrates financial viability and your organization is in a position to manage such a budget. This year, different from last year, we've also included a COVID-19 question in the project planning section, where we ask you to describe how your project plan would accommodate any continued COVID-19 limits. For example, how would you adjust your project plan in the case of ongoing lockdowns or ongoing travel and gathering size restrictions? And we'll ask you to explain what impact these adjustments would have on your project and your project budget. People often want to know why applications are declined. There's often a few reasons. Incomplete documentation is one of them. Applications are rejected during the eligibility review phase if documentation is missing and hasn't been supplied, or if it doesn't meet the alignment with our funding areas. So lack of clear alignments. Some activities may not clearly align to the aims of CIRA's 4 funding areas. For example, projects that build online content and networking platforms are not eligible. But resources, tools, or research that are developed must connect directly to one of the 4 funding areas. Unclear project outcomes is another problem with some projects. The activities may be described in the application, but the intended outcomes and impact of the project are less clear. CIRA is interested in knowing the specific changes you expect to result from your initiative. Concerns about project budget are often an issue. For example, if certain project costs lack detail or are perceived as too high or unnecessary, the project may be ranked lower. Also, the financial request that you're making in the budget must be proportionate to the size and capacity of your organization, and all the in-kind contributions from your organization and others should be reflected. A lack of innovation is another concern. The project may not reflect adequate innovation or an original approach to meeting a community need. I will say, however, that high demand is probably the biggest reason applications are not funded, because we receive hundreds of applications and there are only so many we can fund. In 2020, we received well over 100 eligible applications and we're only able to fund 20. So in general, we fund about 15 to 20% of the projects that come in. We never know how many are going to come in. COVID may present even more projects this year, we're not sure. But in the past, it's been about 15 to 20% of the projects that come in. There are some documents that you need to have ready when you go to apply. They are a completed application form, obviously, and a budget. In addition, the other materials that are required that you should have ready are your proof of eligibility. So examples of proof can be documentation confirming your charitable status and incorporation or your nonprofit incorporation. People applying from universities or colleges should provide a letter confirming that they're employed by the academic institution. In addition, nonprofits and charities have specific documents that they must provide. A list of board of directors with the board members' contact information, including organizations, titles, phone numbers, and emails. A copy of your most recent audited financial statements. And if you do not have audited financial statements, we accept reviewed statements conducted by an accountant that have been signed by 2 members of your board. So not every organization has audited financial statements, so that's a fallback. We also look for a current year 2021 operating budget. So please ensure that the operating budget that you submit clearly indicates the year. We often receive documents that don't have any dates on them. So an operating budget shows your planned revenue and expenses for your organization's activities in the current year, your whole initiative, like the whole organization, not just the specific project to CIRA. The operating budget would need to cover the period until December 2021 at a minimum. And for any projects above 100,000, a 2-year forecasted budget is required. Universities are not required to provide their organizational budgets. However, they must provide a resume for the lead researcher. So that's a lot of documents. All of this information is to be submitted through our online application system. And these are the materials that are checked internally at CIRA for completeness before your application can be moved forward to the evaluation panel. And as we've mentioned, did I say this already? At least 50% of applications need corrections or additions, and often in these documents. So we encourage you to submit in advance of the April 14th deadline. There's no need to provide any additional documentation beyond what we request in the online application system. The panel will review and receive only the application form and the attachments we've requested. So if you're wondering what this online application system looks like, there is a sample of the application form on our website. You can see the URL there where you can find it. And it provides explanations all the way through to clarify what is being asked of you in each question. Some people use the sample application form as a guide to draft their responses offline in another document and then cut and paste them into the online application system when they're ready. If you have a poor internet connection, that might be a good way to approach it. So this is where you submit applications, cipapplication.cira.ca. You can go directly to that URL, or there is also a link to it from our How to Apply section on CIRA's grants website. And our whole application system is on a grants platform that we've customized on SurveyMonkey Apply. If you've never applied for a CIRA grant before, you will be new to the system. So you would use the register button in the upper right-hand corner to create your account. If you have applied to CIRA's grants before, your account will still be in the system. You can log in under the email address of the past application. If you've forgotten your password, as we all do many times, you can just change it right there on the spot. And this is what it looks like when you log into our online application system. You'll see the first set of tasks you need to complete on the desktop. So you see application form 2021, upload proof of eligibility, upload budget sheet, authorization form. Once you identify your organization type, whether it's nonprofit, charity, or academic, within the application form, and complete and submit that form, additional tasks relevant to your type of organization will appear. So the tasks and documentation required differ depending on your organization type. Also on the left-hand side, you can see that you can add other people called collaborators if you want multiple people working on your application. Once you submit all of the relevant documents, one task remains before your application submission is complete. A representative in your organization with signing authority must complete the authorization form, confirming that they approve the application form and budget. So that's a thing that you don't want to leave to the last minute in case you need somebody, excuse me, somebody who is maybe not as easily available. Make sure that you've got them lined up to sign your document when you're ready to submit it to us. And then the final step in the process is to click on Submit. Prior to pressing Submit, you can make changes to any part of your application, the uploads, the form. You can come in and out of the system over and over again and keep editing. But once you press Submit, you can no longer make any changes and your application is moved on to the eligibility review stage. You can download a copy of your application anytime. This is for the project budget in our system. We ask that you use an Excel form that must first be downloaded through the online system. Then you fill it out offline, save it, and then re-upload it into the system. So you can't really see it here on this slide, but that's the document you must use for budget. Here are a few tips for completing the budget form. Total revenues on your budget must match total expenses. So that's something we look for and check. We want you to present your total project budget. And if the total project budget is greater than the amount being requested from CIRA, please show the other sources of funding you're seeking or that you've already confirmed. Also, please ensure you reflect the value of all in-kind contributions within the revenue and expenses section. CIRA doesn't fund ongoing core costs or full-time staff positions, but you can present the costs of delivering the project. And if that includes people time, that's fine. You can show, for example, a project coordinator and the % of time they are allocated to the project and their pay rate for that work. You can also allocate up to 15% of your grant request towards project administration. That means the overhead costs of delivering the project, rent, accounting, management, things that make it possible for your project to run at all. For each project expense line, please explain how you arrived at your estimates. You can provide detailed cost breakdowns wherever possible. For example, show hourly rates, equipment costs broken down, estimates for all aspects of travel or other kinds of expenses related to project delivery. You can keep estimates on file if you receive quotes from potential vendors. And finally, the financial request from CIRA must be in line with your organization's size and capacity. So if you make it all the way through that and are selected as a grant recipient, you are provided with a final report form that you must complete 90 days after the grant period ends. So that form takes from your application form and restates what you told us and asks how the project results compared to what was projected at the beginning. So your application form is a commitment to what you want to do, and then the final report plays that back to see how it went. A sample copy of the final report form is available on our website, so you can see in advance what information will be requested of you if your project is selected for funding. I think it's back to Erica now.
Yes, so now a few tips before we get into the questions. So really to familiarize yourself with the types of projects we're looking to fund, you can look up the 2020 grant recipients on our website. The funding areas and priorities this year are the same as in 2020, so you can find that all on our website to see examples of projects in each category. As Maureen said, we do want to emphasize that it's important to submit your application well before the deadline, so there's no last minute delays caused by incorrect or missing information from the eligibility review. Emails will be automatically generated as part of the application process, and these are the emails to watch for. So please make sure you check your junk mail, spam, and quarantine folders for these emails that you'll likely see from us. And you will receive confirmation in an email once your application has been successfully submitted. So watch for that. And if you're unsure, you can email us at cip@cira.ca, and that's where you can reach us and you can reach Maureen. So those are a few tips, and now we will go into our questions. I know that's a lot of information to take in one go, and we're happy to take time to answer some questions now. And I see there are a bunch already submitted. So we'll start with one here for you, Maureen, about who is eligible. So are local governments and municipalities eligible?
Unfortunately, municipalities and local governments are not eligible for this funding. It's nonprofits, charities, and academic institutions.
Mm-hmm. And our First Nations community is eligible?
Yes, First Nations communities are eligible.
Okay. There's a question on the grant and the amount. So is there any specific criteria to receive the 250,000 grant? Wondering what specific projects CIRA would be interested in funding with the 250,000. We want to know if we would be qualified to help us choose between that 100,000 or 250,000 category.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I don't have any guidance to offer on that. The idea was that if the 250 doesn't get granted, then it gets broken into the overall pool of funds, and so lots of projects, additional projects get funded. But if there's a $250,000 project that really stands out, the evaluation panel and actually CIRA is very keen to look at supporting larger initiatives. So the criteria are the same. Obviously, with a larger project, it's going to be given more scrutiny in terms of deliverables and looking closely at the plan and the budget. But other than that, it's basically the exact same process as for the up to $100,000 grants. The other thing I should clarify is anything over $100,000. So if, for example, for some reason you decided to put in a project for $125,000, which I don't recommend, it would get considered as part of the $250,000 bucket. So that's up to 250 versus up to 100.
Okay. Another question here, could you provide examples of how successful applicants have assured sustainability beyond the life cycle of the project?
Yeah, I think sustainability is one of those sort of nightmare questions that funders always ask and organizations always go, oh my God, what do they mean? In this case, it's, so you produce training, for example, maybe you've developed the first instance of how to train teachers in artificial intelligence. You've developed something with the project funds that is something that you can use over and over again. So the fact of that project creating that was what was made possible through the grant, but the sustainability is the fact that you can use it over and over again, you can share it, you can evolve it and update it. So that's the kind of thing that people would be looking for. With an infrastructure project, obviously you may be getting connectivity for the first time in a place through some form, and the sustainability will be how are you making sure that it gets maintained, or what are your plans for how the community can support that, etc. So it may not be something, we don't ask you to say that you can sustain it beyond the project financially, but that you've given some thought to how it will keep persisting as an output after the end of the CIRA funding. I hope that explains it.
Mm-hmm. And a few questions here about applying in conjunction or partnering with another organization. Can you do that? How does that work with a joint submission?
Sure. There has to be one lead organization. So how you then decide to relate to each other, it would be good to clarify in your application form, or sometimes we do suggest that you include that as part of a document that you would upload where it explains, okay, this organization is the lead, but this is our agreement on how the project is going to be implemented. If you are going into a joint organization approach to the grant, then explaining what the relationship is and how it's going to work is very helpful to the evaluation panel. We do have often a number of applicants from organizations that apply through, for example, Makeway, which is a platform for a lot of different type of nonprofit organizations. So Makeway is the lead applicant, but the organization is the lead applicant, but Makeway is kind of the host. So that is something that we're fairly familiar with. Makeway used to be called Tides, if you're familiar with that name. Otherwise, another variation that we've seen and recommend sometimes is if you have a really great project, but you're not the right organization type for some reason. If you are a small business or something, yet you partner with one of the eligible project types, or sorry, applicant types. So with a nonprofit or with an academic institution, that's another a possible collaborative approach. So we've seen pretty much all different forms of applications from different types of organizations, but one of them has to be the lead applicant that takes all of the responsibility for the contract and the project and reporting and managing the money, etc. So any variations to that you would need to explain in your application.
Okay, great. I see there are a few other questions about that too, so that's great. For the open source requirement, example, a training program, does that mean that training materials have to be available to the public after the program?
That's the idea, yes, that they would be available in a way that people can benefit from them publicly.
Okay. And can K-12 education institutions apply, and who would need to be the applicants? So versus lead researcher as a university as a comparison.
Oh, I see. So in that case, the K-12 is referring to who benefits from the project, not who can apply for the project. So if there were students in K-12 that were going to benefit from the project, then some institution would need to apply on their behalf. So, in some cases we have projects that are organized around developing digital literacy materials for teachers to deliver to kids in school. So it's not the kids in school that are applying, it's the kids in school that are benefiting and the nonprofit organization that's applying. So that's how we understand it. We wouldn't expect students K-12 to be applying. That isn't one of the eligible applicant categories. It would have to be nonprofit, registered charity, or a university or college with a lead researcher on the project.
Okay, great. And a couple of questions about working with First Nations communities. So often First Nations communities work under the umbrella of a First Nations authority or a council. Are these kind of organizations eligible?
Yes, they are. We prefer if there's a way that it can be a nonprofit, but due to the nature of how First Nations are constituted in different ways, we've decided to just make First Nations eligible to apply. However, if there is a nonprofit version of how the First Nation is operating, that's also, we like to see that too. But First Nations can apply as First Nation.
Okay. Does the project need to be new, or do we support ongoing projects that fit? We don't usually do like another year of a project. It would be a new feature being developed in a project, or a new audience, or something that is different. It wouldn't be, can we have year 2 of doing the same thing that we're already doing? So it isn't continuation funding that's available. It is one-off new project funding, which, in the world of fundraising, I know is frustrating, but CIRA has limited scope in terms of sort of ongoing support to initiatives. And so the way we've decided that we can make the best impact with the resources we have is through one-off projects that happen within a year or so. And then those organizations, when that project is complete, can apply again, but not for a continuation of the same project. It would have to be a new feature or something, a new development or an evolution of what the project is about. Okay, thanks. A question here from Justin. If we have a larger project in mind and have applied for funding from other sources as well, do we have to have proof of funding from those other sources? Funding deadlines are similar and we won't know until a bit later from all sources. Yep,
that's a very common situation. If you don't know, if you don't have confirmation of the funding you've applied for, you can show it as part of the project budget and show that it's pending. If you have information about when you'll know, you can include that in the budget sheet. So we like to see that you've thought about, okay, if my project is $150,000 and I'm asking CIRA for 75, and I expect the remainder to come from 3 other sources that we are talking to but haven't heard from yet, you would identify those The more concrete it is that if you can identify them and when you're going to hear, then that gives us a sense of how likely it is that other funding is going to happen, or you can give us a sense of where you're at with that. It doesn't mean CIRA wouldn't fund it if it's not confirmed by the time we're decision making. What can often happen is an organization applies with the idea that they are going to get, 3 or 4 other sources of funding, and 2 of them come through and a different one than they anticipated comes through. So we would get that information in a project budget report at the end of the project. And sometimes it requires you to change your project plan, but so we like to see what you're thinking in terms of what requests you already have out at the application stage.
Mm-hmm. Great. A couple questions here about under the internet infrastructure umbrella that we have. Would a grant be available to bring more residents up to speed, or would we be eligible if you're applying for like upgrading existing internet infrastructure?
Potentially, I wouldn't say no. I think if it's going to make a big difference for a lot of people, and I don't mean, millions, but if it's going to make a significant difference and there are people that are currently cut off and can't access, and this is going to improve that situation for them, then yeah, I wouldn't say it's a no. It doesn't sound as innovative, but that is something that projects get scored on. So it may not score full marks there, but obviously if you're meeting a need in a community, the panel is certainly interested in seeing how you're going to do that and would look at that possibility.
Okay, thanks. So one question here, you indicated funding will not support the purchase of devices to own, but would it support something like libraries lending out devices for kids K-12 who live in vulnerable situations?
Yeah, we have done that in the past. Libraries have received, as long as they're registered as a nonprofit organization or charity, they have been able to run programs of hotspot lending and lending out laptops. As I mentioned earlier, we wouldn't fund like only equipment. So it would have to be some kind of program that not only makes makes that hardware available to the community, but also has some kind of programming around it, is actually building digital skills, not just providing access in that particular way. So it's kind of a balancing act, because we don't want to just fund a whole bunch of laptops. It's not the priority in the program. So if there's a way to connect it to specific community activities that are going on, that would probably do better.
Okay. A couple of questions here on metrics and measuring. So this question's from Glenn. What is the expected metrics on the number of people trained for digital literacy? Any requirements as to gender, low income, etc.?
No, there are some set metrics that we ask about. So we do want to find out how many students you're going to reach, how many rural, remote, indigenous, northern. Those are questions that we look at, but we don't have specific target numbers of how many. I think the panel really looks for what is the biggest impact that we can have. And it's not always the biggest number of people that you can reach, it's the biggest difference you can make. So that's where we're really interested in hearing from applicants about the results that they're expecting, the change in the community that they're expecting, what difference is this project going to make? And then it doesn't matter if it's for 50 people or 500,000 people, it's about what difference is it going to make. And so we don't break down beyond the target communities that we are trying to reach, although there is a place in the application form where you can specify the specific communities that you are trying to reach beyond the targets that we have for this year. So that will be taken into account.
Okay. And does a project have to fit exclusively in one funding priority, in one of our funding areas?
No, it doesn't. On the application form, you are asked to choose one, and what ends up that kind of forces some specific questions that you get asked later in the application form, particularly around beneficiaries and project outputs and targets. So if you choose infrastructure, it asks you a certain set of things. If you choose digital literacy, it asks you a certain set of things. So we recommend that you choose the category, the funding area that is the main, if there is a main part that you would want to have your project measured on, and then you can still refer to the fact that it will also produce results in one or more of the other areas. So it doesn't preclude you from applying if your project touches on more than one of our funding areas.
Okay, great. Let's see, another question here around funding amounts. Is there a preference for larger projects, say 75 to 100 versus smaller, like 10 to 15 projects? Or is each judged really on its own merit regardless of the funding ask?
The latter. So there is no preference. People look at, what they think is going to make a difference in that community, and not everybody needs $100,000 to do a thing that is going to make a big difference. So we've funded projects that are $20,000, $15,000, $7,000. That doesn't, the panel isn't prejudiced against small budget projects at all. But we've also learned over time that some communities actually need more resources to make bigger changes just because of the cost of doing some of these kinds of projects. Like $100,000 doesn't go very far on many kinds of infrastructure projects. And so for those ones, we often see budgets that come in that are $500,000 and CIRA is being asked for a piece of that. So it really depends on what you're trying to do, and there's no discrimination against small projects. We like all projects.
Okay. A couple other questions here. So question from Jane. I asked, yes, if the majority of beneficiaries for the project are in Indigenous communities, Indigenous people living in the cities, can they still be classified?
If you're concerned that they are not part of a First Nation reserve or living on a reserve, but they're living in an urban setting, that would be fine. I'm not sure if that's what the question means. But we do ask about Indigenous communities or people. So where they are located doesn't really matter, but I'm not sure if I've understood the question correctly.
I think that was the question there. If you have another question around that, Jane, feel free to write it in the question box as well. Another question here, what percentage of the budget can be allocated to the evaluation of the project?
Well, we don't require evaluation of your project. So I know some funders say that has to be part of your project. We don't require that. We do require when you're reporting that you reflect on, did you achieve what you said you were going to, but we don't expect that you are going to hire someone to evaluate the project. So it's up to you. If you want to make that part of your project, then you would have to get the costing to see how much that would cost. For us, there's no reason not to do it, and there's no reason that you can't budget whatever it costs, but we don't have a specific limit on it. I think the panel might be more interested in, the project delivery than the evaluation of it. So if evaluation serves your purposes, you could build that in part of it, but maybe not make it too huge a part of the project.
Okay, great. A question from Rebecca here from earlier. Where does CIRA's funding come from, funding sources, and are letters of support at all beneficial in applications?
Those are two good questions. All of the money that we have available for this come through our sale of .ca. So we have 3 million domains under registration, and that generates revenue every year, as well as other cybersecurity products and services that CIRA sells. But basically it's from sales and renewals of .ca. So anytime somebody buys a .ca domain name, a very tiny portion of that goes towards our ability to do this funding each year. So that's where the $1.25 million comes from, is our sale of services. We're a not-for-profit organization ourselves, and so we any revenue or surplus that we generate, we put back into our various community initiatives, and the grants is one of those. And the other question, I've sort of lost track.
If letters of
Oh yes, letters of support.
support.
Thank you.
Yes.
Letters of support are not required. The one exception to that would be if you are doing a partnership project and you're approaching as multiple organizations, we would want to see some kind of MOU or something between the different partners about how they're going to work together. But letters of support are not required as part of the application and wouldn't necessarily get looked at because they aren't one of the required uploads.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Maureen. One question here is, let's see, you talked about equipment and how that kind of is, and now around digital literacy. Are projects of online training of internet use for students eligible for a grant? Would that fall under digital literacy?
Yeah, if you're teaching students how to use the internet, that falls under digital literacy. If it's teaching very basic, like how to use a computer, not really. So ideally, it's building skills in a particular area of related to the internet, but teaching students how to use the internet safely and effectively is digital literacy. I think we're about 5 minutes from, close to 5 minutes to the hour. So I don't know, Erica, how many questions there are left, but we should probably think about wrapping them up and then sending people off.
Yes, so I think we've answered most of the questions here. The few that I still see are around, yes, we are recording this webinar and it will be available online on our website. For questions about how to, if your question is eligible, if you have more specific questions, you can reach out to Maureen at cip@cira.ca. And that's really other questions you have. That's where you can reach us.
Yes, that's here's some contact information. So any further questions that weren't answered today, you can write to cip@cira.ca. Also, if you run into any trouble with the online application system, the best people to help with that is SurveyMonkey Apply, but we also try to help people navigate if you run into trouble. But they do have a help desk that is meant to help people use that online environment for applications. So we recommend you reach out to them if you're having problems with the platform. And anything else about the funding or eligibility or your specific project, you can direct to cip@cira.ca. I'll remind you that our deadline is April 14th at 2 p.m. So questions that you have, send them sooner than later. Applications that you have, submit them sooner than later, and that will put you in a good position for getting your project reviewed and moving through the process.
Thanks everyone for tuning in today.
Yes, thanks so much. We'll say goodbye to you now, and hopefully we'll be seeing your projects coming through the system soon. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, thanks.